Hey there, welcome back to Coding at Home with the Code Hub. Hey, welcome back. Hope everybody enjoyed their weekend. And for those of you who joined us for the look back session on Friday, I hope you had a ton of fun. I thought it was a much different environment, a bit more personal instruction, and hopefully you found it interesting. We're gonna do the same thing again this Friday. We're gonna be looking at the Hello Byte playground because we only got through a few playground pages. We set a few people up with Swift Playgrounds on their iPad, and I hopefully they found it useful. We've had some good quotes from some of our participants who really enjoyed the sessions and got a lot out of it. And it's a good look back for those people who maybe have done a bit of programming but want a refresher and say, all right, let me see how I use commands again, and it might click in certain other ways for you. This week we're going back to the same old stuff. We're going back to lights, camera, code. We're going back to assemble your camera. We're going to talk about building an application, customizing our own camera. We're going to work on our designs. Hopefully some of you worked on your designs over the weekend. And we're going to start adding those things to our camera code. I just posted a video this morning. I recorded one over the weekend about classes and how inheritance works. And I'll put that in the description so you can go check that out. Hopefully it'll give you a different spin on how to think of classes and inheritance and how you might organize your code. Last note, we also have the Swift Student Challenge still. If anybody's interested in trying their hand at a Swift Playground for the judges to evaluate for WWDC 2020, shoot us a note at codingathome@thecodehub.ie, and we'll try to help you out and get you on your way. All right, let's go over the iPad and check out our camera stuff. All right, so we're off in assemble your camera, that playground again. I'm going to open it up and we'll get going. So if you recall, if you haven't done anything over the weekend, you may be thinking, "Oh God, what have I done? Where is my code? What's going on again?" If that's the case, that happens because sometimes you need to. This is a lot of organization, and you need to build this all up in your head and have an idea of where everything is and how it all hangs together. So usually it takes you a couple minutes to get back into the swing of things when you're coming back to some code that you wrote in the past. So easiest way for you to do that is to go through some of these previous ones. So we've talked about your camera class. We're now adding components to our camera class. Last week we discovered that if we write code in the MyCamera tab here, it'll persist across all the playground pages, which means that it won't disappear. Whereas if we're writing code in here in the main file, this will change when I go to the next page. So if I go back to my previous page and I look at my main, it says my width is 400, my height is 300. I even added a corner radius to the camera. If I go forward again and I tap on my main, the width here is 400 and the height is 500. So it's different than the code that I wrote in the previous page. So if you're confused about why some of your changes aren't coming over, especially if you're looking at the size of your camera on the screen, that might be the first place to look, is go back and say, oh, does my space add method, have I used the same parameters for that I used for the previous one? And we can talk a little bit later about, not today, but maybe down the line, about how to organize it then, so that it does show up all the time. We've learned that in MyCamera, this code will persist and it will stay the same across all the different playground pages. So maybe that's where we need to put some of that code. So where we left off on Thursday was we were adding components to our camera class. We added the properties here. So just inside of our class declaration, remember, anywhere where we have these, same thing with this is a declaration of a variable, but where we have this class keyword followed by the class name and then a colon and maybe the superclass. right after the opening brace, this is typically where we put our properties for a class. So in this case, we've a property called cameraView, and immediately we assign this cameraView an instance of the cameraView class. And we do the same thing with shutterButton. That's an instance of the button class. The frontBackButton, which is another button class. And then the zoomSlider, which is a slider class. Now, you may not have all those elements if you've decided, actually, do you know what? I'm not going to use the zoomSlider. But we can go into these elements here and tap on them. And this is where we got our variable declarations. Now, I didn't know, maybe I didn't know that there was a class called a button class or a class called the slider class. Well, we're just they've told us in this playground that these are some of the components that we've coded for you and have made available to you that you can take advantage of. And what we'll do is by the end of this project, we'll have looked at places where we can find out, well, how do we find out what types of classes are available to me? What can I use and where can I use them? All right, so we've added all of our components. We've actually created our components here by adding all of these properties. And then if we went to the next page, now we have to add the components. So we set the properties of the space, if you remember. This is what the camera is going to take up on the actual screen and what it's going to look like. We're going to have a corner radius and a border width and a color and a background color. Now, if we didn't do this section here, none of these components would show up because they're just properties on the camera, but we haven't added them to the camera's space. So what we did was we looked over here. If we expand these, we can see that, okay, cool. Here's where we add our camera view at a certain point with a certain size. Same thing with the shutter button. Same thing with the front back button. Same thing with the zoom slider. So your bit of homework over the weekend was to position these so that they roughly reflect what your design looks like. Now, if you remember, I went and created a design in here that looks like this. And here, this here. That's roughly what my design looks like. Now, I didn't retweak that yet in my playground. But maybe you've kind of said, okay, cool. Well, I have my front back button up here, so I had to change where this point is. This is probably going to be, this is the middle. This is positive X, positive Y somewhere up here. This is probably minus Y, positive X for the shutter button. And then the slider goes here. It's probably, if we sit it in the middle, its Y position is 0. And then its X position is negative 50 or so. And this is the kind of thing that you need to play around with. So if you didn't have a chance to do that over the weekend, that's something I recommend doing tonight. I'll do it tonight so that my layout looks a little bit more like MyCamera. And we'll see what we have tomorrow. But for now, what we'll do is we'll just use the generic one. So I'm going to go back to Swift Playgrounds. I basically just dragged all these over here and added them in here. You see, I added a self dot in front of the add functions here. Because I wanted to make it clear on Thursday that we can call a method on ourselves. And you do that using this self keyword. This is kind of a special keyword that you can use inside a class. Because self will refer to the instance of that class. And since we're in the initializer, we're just creating the instance here. We now have access to this self property. So let's hit run my code and see what we have now that we've added all these elements to our camera. So I'm going to say yes, you can access the camera. Okay, cool. This is very different than what I have designed, but that's okay. We'll fix that. I have my viewfinder, I have my zoom slider, I have my two buttons. Now I can't tell them apart unless I go here and look. And we went through that on Thursday. Remember we said, okay, well the front back button is the point that we added it at was minus 150 and Y was minus 150. So that's probably back here. Whereas the shutter button was added at positive 150 and minus 150. So that's this side, because we remember our grid layout. Okay, so that's my layout. I've added the components. Let's go on to the next page and let's see. So all the components appeared in the correct place for now. And my camera is not quite starting to look like the one I designed, but we'll say it is just for the sake of moving on. Now this is a little note that we did talk about on Thursday that's worth going over. These are the different elements. This explains to you how to add elements to your class and then how to use them. So if we tap here, it'll explain that we create components at the top level of the class. These components are just properties. Well, remember when we talked about types. So now because they're available, they're at the top of the class, they're available inside the whole class. So in any method that we write, or say the initializer function, we can access those properties. And it says here, if we created the components inside the initializer, we can only use them inside the initializer. So that would be here. This is inside the initializer. That's what it means, is between these braces. If you remember the reading code video, that talks about following the braces. So if we follow the braces, this brace here and this brace here match. So that all this is considered inside the init method. So if we tap on the add button here, so this is where we set the properties of the space inside the initializer. So we have the properties declared outside, and then we set them up in here. And then it mentions that we're going to create the class in our main file. We're going to call that initializer, which will execute code in these braces. Okay, so we've roughly got that down. That's looking all right. So then we have a question here. Why do you create the components at the top level of the class? So creating components inside the initializer is too late. You want the components to be available everywhere in the class. There isn't enough room to write everything in the initializer. Well, we just read that we want the components to be available everywhere in the class. Did everyone get that? Hopefully everyone got that. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next page. We're going to add a function that turns the camera on, because so far we've just got the design done. So let's hit next. And we're on the starting your camera page. All right, so now we're underway. Can I explain initializers? All right, I've had a request, an urgent request to explain initializers. So if we go back to our main file, this is great that we get instant feedback. You can also try this on the chat on Twitch. You could send us through questions. I probably won't get them till after the session is done, but I'll definitely try to address them the next day. You can also send us notes to live@thecodehub.ie with questions, and we'll try to answer them online the next day. So if you remember from our types episode, we talked about types and initializers. So we define this type here called MyCamera, which is fine, and it's basically a blueprint for how we want MyCamera to be set up. In the special classes video that I just posted, we talk about dogs and, for example, a dog class and a dolphin class. And they're basically blueprints for properties and behaviors on a dog or on a dolphin. But when we want to actually get a dog or a dolphin, we need to create an instance of that class. So the way we do that is by using the type name. And in our case, we don't have any parameters for our initializer. If we look over at MyCamera, we have this special function, and it's not even got a func keyword, called init. And you can see the two empty parentheses. means that there are no parameters. So you would just call it like this MyCamera with an open parentheses and a closed parentheses will create an instance of a camera for you. So what happens when you do that is Swift says, okay, cool. They're asking for a new instance of MyCamera. So I'll go off to the MyCamera class. I'll look for the initializer. We'll say that, oh, yep, they're overriding the initializer for their super class. When I jump in here, I'll say, oh, they've called super init. So I have to go off to this space class and call the initializer on that as well. And then when I'm done, I'll come back here and I'll set up all the properties on my class. So I'll set up the background color. I'll set up the border color, border width, corner radius. And if you remember a couple pages ago, if you don't do any of that stuff, if you don't set up a background color or a border color or width or corner radius or background image, your camera won't show up because it needs those properties to be able to show up on the space. That's a special feature of our MyCamera class and the space class that we need to add a background color and a border color. But that's just something to note when you're initializing an instance of MyCamera, is that you have to do a bit of this setup code. This is all setup code saying, okay, I'm going to configure MyCamera so that it's ready to use, so that when I hand it back over to them here in the main file, it's all ready to go. So our camera has a border property, it has a background color, corner radius, it has all the components added to it that I expect to have in a camera. And then once I have that configured camera, I'm going to add it to my own space to show it on the screen. So that's what the initializer is for. It's a special method that gets called when you create an instance of a class like this. All right, so let's get ready to hook up our camera. Okay, so this is saying we got to write a start function. So it says, and the cameraView is the thing that allows us to preview what the camera is seeing. So it says here, open the MyCamera file. So we're going to be adding this to our own special camera class. And we're going to write the following code below this comment, start function. Okay, so let's see. If we go looking for that, it's not up here. This is where we created the components. There's a comment here for adding an output that we'll get to later. Here's our initializer that gets called when we create an instance of MyCamera. We're going to connect the components later in the initializer. And then we're going to style the components inside the initializer. Okay. And here we go. Here's my start function. And we can see other comments for a slider function, notify inputs function, front back function. These are all going to be behaviors on our MyCamera class. So let's go here. We're going to write the following code below that comment there. We're going to call it public. So I'll start typing out public. You could drag this over from here. Remember, if you tap on this black area, you can drag it out. But I'll type it out while you're dragging. So we'll call it public func. And we'll call it start. Now you could call it something else. I particularly like it when our behaviors are named really well. Now remember our methods, which is our behaviors, start with a lowercase letter typically. And usually they're kind of action words like start. If I didn't know that I was calling this method on a camera instance, I might call this start camera or start viewfinder, something like that. But this, because I'm on a camera, start will work for now. So what we're going to do is we have this property on us called cameraView. So I can access that here in this function. CameraView. And we'll use dot notation to call a method on our cameraView called start. So this is kind of a cool way to structure our classes. So we have a component inside of our camera, and we're basically designing this so that we can say, hey, you know what? If you want a camera quick and easy, use MyCamera class, because I'll make it really easy for you to start to do certain functions that you would expect from a camera, like start the viewfinder. And really all we're doing there is we have a viewfinder attached to us, and we're passing through the message start off to the camera view. Now we can do other setup things in here. Maybe we change the border width when someone starts the camera, or we change the corner radius, or we do something to make people see that something's actually happened on the camera. But for now, all we're doing is passing that message on to the camera view to start. There's a note about public. If you're confused, why am I writing public? Because I've never really had to write public before. There's a note here about why you're using public. Because we've got this code defined in another file, we need to make sure that Swift can make it available to all the other code inside this app that we're running. So by giving it that public keyword, we're telling Swift, hey, it's cool for other people to call this function. All right, so now that we have our start function, let's hit return. Let's go to the next page. Now we have a start function on our class. So now we're going to go back to the code in main to call the function. So let's go tap on this little bookmark icon here. There's a note here that says start the camera. Okay, we can do that. And we're just going to do that by taking our variable, which is a camera instance, and say camera dot start. Now if we run our code, we should see live video in the viewfinder. So let's try that out. Okay, great. Not bad. I see it. I see the back camera. I have no way I can press these buttons, but they don't do anything yet. So it's not super exciting, but at least I know that my camera view has turned on. So let's stop that and go on to the next page. Then we have another little quiz. What does the word public mean in front of a class name or function? So let's see. We have a few different options. Anybody can make changes to a public class or function. You can call a public class or function from code in its own file, but not from code in any other file. And then code in the main file or any other file can use a public class or function. Well, we just talked about that. We read the little blurb about it. What do you think the answer is? So if you guessed, or hopefully you knew, that the code in the main file or any other file can use the public class or function, you were right. All right, so let's go on to the next one. And you've got one little trophy to show for it. So now that we've got the camera working, let's hook up the shutter button. So this is kind of nice. They've diagrammed out how we expect it to behave. And we can tap on these little targets here to find out what they're talking about. This looks like the shutter button. So if we tap there, it says, okay, cool, that's a button. If we tap there, this is the interaction with the button. So the shutter button's pressed output is connected to the camera view's trigger input. When you press the shutter button, it tells the camera view to take a photo. Okay, well this second sentence probably makes a bit more sense than this first one. But we'll see what this means in a second. This shutter button's pressed output is connected to the camera view's trigger input. And then if we tap here, we'll see the camera view. This is a really handy thing to do if you're designing an application and you want to figure out how people are going to interact with your app. What we've done so far has been very static design. You design the camera and what it's going to look like. These kind of diagrams where we have little arrows and little notes about what the interaction does is much more interesting for an app, because the app is going to be a lot more dynamic. People are going to interact with it. They're going to touch the screen. They're going to drag things and tap on buttons or use an Apple Pencil on your app. So there's a lot more interesting interaction someone can have with an app than just a flat image. All right, so let's do this. Let's open the MyCamera file. So we're going to tap on this tab. And it says here, write the following code in below this comment in the initializer. Connect the components. So if we scroll back up, we can see, oh yeah, here's the connect to the components piece. So here, if we read this code, it says shutterButton.pressed. So that's a property on shutterButton. .connect. And then to cameraView.trigger. Okay, well those are some properties and some capabilities on these components that maybe we didn't know existed till now. I mean, this is what we're doing, is we're reading through this documentation to kind of discover how these components work. So let's try that. I'm going to type that out. You can tap and drag that out if you want. So I'm going to say shutterButton dot pressed. And then we're going to say, cool. So when the shutter button is pressed, we're going to connect this. And this code looks horrible, but we'll trust it for now. So connect to, if you look here, cameraView.trigger. That's what we want to connect it to. And the nice thing about this particular interface, they call these things, when you talk about the properties and behaviors and what they look like on your class and how someone would use it, that's often called the interface or the application programming interface. And they shorten it to API because as programmers, we love our acronyms because some of these words are far too hard to say all the time anyway. But this is a really nice, and this is what Apple excels at, I feel, is naming their APIs and making them very readable and very understandable. So I can read this and go, shutterButton.pressed, connect to cameraView trigger. That makes a lot of sense to me from an English language point of view. I can just say, oh yeah, cool. I can kind of guess what that's going to do because it's been named really well. So let's try running our code and see what we have. All right, so there we go. We have our camera views up. Okay, I get the flash of the screen. It looks like I'm taking a picture. Okay, that's a start. I think we've done it. We've hooked it up. We can see that, okay, the other button is the front back button, so it's not doing anything yet because we haven't connected that to anything. But we can see that on the button class, there's this pressed property that we can use. And that'll let us connect it to other elements on the screen to let us react to those button presses. This is really cool because now we can start to take user input from our users and we can react to it. Just like when we handed over our iPad with the answers playground after we'd built a quiz and we handed it over to our friend and they tapped in their answers and then they gave it back to you. That's them interacting with your code. This is the same thing right here. This is our users starting to interact with our code. And now we can get messages in from our users to say, okay, cool, they're using this button. Now what do we do? This is a huge amount of stuff. We're going to stop here for today. We won't go on to that very last screen of the instructions on this page because we're going to pick up with this page again tomorrow to work through connecting up these elements. Because this string of dot notation calls to the pressed property and the connect method and then connecting it to the cameraView.trigger. That's a lot to take in. And if you're someone who really likes to understand everything you're doing, you could go down a really large rabbit hole. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick this up again tomorrow. If you haven't designed your camera, please do it this evening and let's try to get your layout done so that your camera looks the way your design expects it to look and not just like this generic thing that I've come up with over here. And we'll pick up with this again tomorrow. All right, we'll see you then.